Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's program. My name is Arthur Demrich. I'm the director of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Today, in partnership with the Center for Protection of Intellectual Property, we're thrilled to bring you the program, Vaccines, Intellectual Property, and Global Equity. We're exploring a really challenging set of issues regarding patents and vaccines that tend to be massively oversimplified in how they're reported in the press and other media. The core issues, as I see it, and you'll hear from our excellent panelists in a few minutes, really relate to some fundamental and deep issues around incentives to develop new vaccines, ways of organizing how we invent vaccines, how we manufacture vaccines, how we deliver vaccines to people, and third, really what approach would foster greater equity around the world. So in a way, we're looking at legal dimensions, economic and business perspective, as well as ethical issues. And those ethical issues are less around individual choice and more around the relationship of the rich world to developing countries. For many decades, the developing world was seen first as a charity case, then as a rising business opportunity, and in recent years, at times, even as strategic rivals. COVID is showing that poor places are far more vulnerable to crises. So the policies on trade, on intellectual property, and on how we empower inventors, especially inventors in developing countries, are really important. Those issues are not easy to combine into a single panel, but today's a really remarkable opportunity to do so. You'll hear more from our panelists in just a few minutes. Just some protocols. So the chat feature is enabled. We encourage you to communicate with each other using that. If you want to pose a question to our panel, which we also strongly encourage, please use the Q&A feature. The moderator will bring those. And the program has live captioning. So if you click on closed caption button, you can access the captioning. And last, the program is being recorded, but you, the attendees, are not being recorded. We're beginning today with some historical perspective that I'm bringing from Smithsonian. And I want to take us back to 1721 and smallpox. Cotton Mather, who many of you will have heard of, famously had learned about inoculation from one of his enslaved persons, one Simus, when he observed a scar on his shoulder and asked him about it. In May 1721, a smallpox outbreak began in Boston, and Mather contacted physicians around the city, many of whom, along with the preachers and city leaders, strongly opposed the practice, considering it risky and against God's will to intentionally expose someone to a disease. But he found a physician who did support the practice, Zabdiel Boylston. Those of you in Boston know the Boylston name. And they inoculated some 242 people. Of them, only 6 would die, compared to a 14% fatality among the general population. And Mather kept a journal in which he describes this in some detail, his efforts to inoculate. At the same time, it also raised opposition. So there were pamphlets produced in favor of it, as well as opposing it. And then famously, when Mather was inoculating one of his, fellow physicians, somebody threw a grenade through the window, which did not explode, but then said, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you, I'll inoculate you with this, a pox to you." So fortunately, that did not slow him down. He continued, and yet it shows you that opposition to inoculation and then later to vaccination has been with us literally from the beginnings. It's also an interesting case, of course, of knowledge coming from an indigenous community into what becomes more formalized medical practice. What we see here now, where in the course of the 19th century, a variety of technologies were developed, many of them patented, to vaccinate people. So smallpox vaccination, in fact, becomes prevailing, very common over the course of the 19th century. And then there are a diverse set of technologies invented to make it easier to inoculate and then vaccinate. So we literally have dozens of these patent models in the Smithsonian's American History collection. Between about 1836 and the 1880s, inventors would submit a physical working prototype along with the written description of their patent. And so we have around 10,000 of these total, which are an amazing record of American invention through the 19th century. What you also see here are that physicians would go around this scab carrier used by a Baltimore physician, carrying a small amount of the smallpox with them in order to inoculate. And then there's also technologies related to how you inoculate to keep the wound protected. So you have these screens that go over the inoculation wound to protect it from other forms of infection, which is of course a major concern. And then in 1977, a major global campaign ensues to eradicate smallpox, the one disease that we have fully eradicated. A remarkable success story that also again relates in part to some of the technologies of how you administer the vaccine. And so you see this hypodermic injection apparatus that really any health professional with very modest amounts of training could do. And that was a key piece of the success of vaccinating the globe. I'm going to jump back in time briefly to the 18th century, because there's an interesting case study here around what we patent, what we don't patent. So there's bilious pills that were very popular in the late 18th, early 19th century, in fact, through the 19th century. These were also called thunderclappers at times. They were used to treat constipation. Constipation at the time was seen as a kind of metric or an indication that you were going to come down with something much more serious. But of course, also related to the diet at the time, which had quite a few more dried meats, especially in the winter, and salted meats, and far fewer fresh vegetables than we have access to today. So Dr. Lee's bilious pills became a major market. They are in fact the first US patent for pill of any kind and the first in its patent class, issued in 1796. Within a couple of years, another Samuel Lee also had patented and started marketing bilious pills. That led to a huge amount of newspaper advertising, accusations, and litigation. But in that time period, prior to 1836 reforms, American patents were less exclusive and less exclusionary than they would become over the course of the 19th century. The medical profession, for its part, by the latter part of the 19th century, began to look down on patented drugs as overly commercial and thus suspect. That would change with the rise of scientific medicine, the emergence of a synthetic chemical industry, and then a pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, we have a rise of therapeutic skepticism in the late 19th, early 20th century, saying a lot of the materia medica of the 19th century, which are mixtures of herbs, sometimes an awful lot of opiates, and then liquid suspensions and alcohol, that those were really suspect and not doing the patient a lot of good. There are some remnants in today's world. So those of you who like an old-fashioned or other mixed drinks, the bitters you consume with those for flavor today originate in 19th century medicine. So I'm going to bring us into the 20th century now and the kind of end of the patent medicine. So the patent medicines, which generally were not patented, but were marketed quite heavily, those even went into animal medicine. So you see here a putative treatment for anthrax for animals, but given all the things it's supposed to treat, I would find that highly suspect. An anthrax vaccine, however, was developed by Pasteur in the 1880s, and his vaccination of sheep and a successful trial was really legendary. The key insight, of course, of Pasteur's work was also that a weakened virus could stimulate an immune system response and thus produce immunity. So the use of a live attenuated vaccine became key to the vaccines we've had ever since. So we also see here a mid-20th century treatment and a number of patents, and those patents again have to do with the production of the anthrax, so how you isolate it, how you store it, how you promote growth of the bacilli. They aren't a patent on anthrax itself. And then I want to touch on the regulation of this sector outside of intellectual property just briefly. And so the images you see here are a horse that was used by the New York City Health Department, and it's being bled for an antitoxin. And in the middle, you see a page from a record book. And so horses were used as factories, as it were, as a production method to produce sera against diphtheria, tetanus, pneumococcus, streptococcus, typhoid, and dysentery. The Biologics Act that would eventually control and regulate and monitor vaccines is linked to a tragedy in St. Louis in 1901. At that time, the standard treatment for children with diphtheria was an antitoxin serum made from the blood of horses that had been exposed to the disease. One of the horses used in St. Louis was put down after contracting tetanus, but the serum from that horse was still used, and some 13 children died. Around the same time, a similar tragedy occurred in Camden, New Jersey, where 9 children died from tetanus from a contaminated vaccine. The 1902 Biologics Act, the virus toxin law, gave the government control over the processes used to make biological products. That would then get folded into the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. Since that time, every batch of a vaccine has been subject to regulatory inspection. And so I like to think and say that, vaccines are actually the most inspected, safest products we put in our bodies. They get, for example, far more inspection than, say, the lettuce you eat. So it's a pretty remarkable area. I'm gonna jump now to polio in the mid-20th century. This is really the last of the major childhood plagues, and it was solved through an incredible research effort, supported both by taxpayers, by donated funds, and by industry. Up until the 20th century, up until the 1940s, really, some 50% of children would die before the age of 12. That was typical. We accepted it. We weren't happy about it as a society, but it was sort of part of life. Polio was then the last of these major childhood scourges. It dates back quite a bit in time. It wasn't as visible as a disease until the 20th century, when the other diseases had been incrementally eliminated. 1952 was the worst polio epidemic that's been recorded, some 58,000 cases. Parents that summer feared letting their children go outside. There are notorious reports, write-ups of children who remember those years of being kept inside all summer. So the events we've been through in the past year have historical precedent, and hopefully we don't have many more repeats. There were a ton of technologies developed to keep children alive. What you see here are some of the most radical ones for children who had trouble breathing because of the paralysis induced by polio. These were, of course, also patented technologies. And it's striking that children at times were in these for just a few weeks, some of them for months, a very few cases for many years. This also is the start of kind of what we would call patient advocacy, patient support. So you get the March of Dimes, which comes out of a 1934 birthday ball held to celebrate Franklin D. Roosevelt's birthday and becomes a major fundraiser. In 1937, Franklin proclaimed and created the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. And the comedian Eddie Cantor suggested that Americans mail in dimes to the White House. So thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dimes came into the White House and creates really the March of Dimes, which then, of course, shifts away from the federal government. Out of that comes this remarkable kind of race to a vaccine. And we get the contrast of the injectable versus oral polio treatments. Salk at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine was really a lead research physician and used an inactivated virus that had been killed and then injected first into monkeys and then humans. Even as Salk was developing that vaccine and initiating the massive trial that included some 2 million children between the ages of 6 and 9, and you see a button there that's given to those children who participate in those trials, the National Foundation looked into patenting this vaccine. They concluded it could not be patented for 2 core reasons. The process of creating and manufacturing it was not novel, and of course, the dead polio itself could not be patented. I'm going to move forward a little more quickly here, just to get us to our panel. In 1980, of course, we have the rise of a new disease that began spreading at an epidemic rate. And the first in decades, it caught the medical system by surprise. And also the fact that it was spreading among a marginalized community played into the kind of weak medical and political responses. And yet we have amazing stories, of course, of patient resilience and patient activism that come about associated with the AIDS pandemic. I raise this because on several occasions, there were vaccines announced that would enter human trials, that it was close, that we were 18 months from a vaccine, that we were 2 years away. None has succeeded to this date. HIV has proven incredibly resistant to a vaccine. The retroviruses mutate very rapidly, and the human immune system does not respond to the HIV virus in the same way. So the antibodies that we measure slow the disease, but do not fully stop it. So we've not been able to stimulate the same kind of antibody response in the body to prevent the spread of AIDS. I want to close out with just some perspective here. We've got around 40 total vaccine and combination products, vaccine combinations, that are effective and in use. You can compare that to about 20,000 other pharmaceuticals if you take a pretty broad view of counting this. So we're really only at the beginning of what we could do with vaccines. And so there's a real interesting question of how do we encourage and stimulate further research in this. There's also relatively few manufacturers worldwide. The WHO only lists 24 countries that have approved vaccine producers within them. At the same time, vaccines, in fact, go to far more people worldwide than any other therapeutic. And so it's really an interesting question of how do we broaden the participation in vaccine research? How do we involve more people and countries in the invention, testing, and distribution of vaccines? So those efforts to stimulate it really come in two main forms. There's push mechanisms of government research support and prizes. And of course, there's pull mechanisms, and intellectual property serves as kind of a market stimulus. And our panelists are going to talk about that in just a minute. I do lastly want to kind of observe the speed with which the COVID-19 vaccines were developed and the safety that they bring is really remarkable in the long human history. And last, we invite people to come to the museum in 2023 and before, of course, when a new exhibit will be opening in sickness and in health that will explore contagious disease and pandemics. With that, I'm pleased to now introduce, there we go. I'm pleased to introduce Sean O'Connor, who's going to be leading the panel discussion today. Sean is a professor of law and executive director of the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. His research focuses on intellectual property and business law with regards to startups and commercializing technology-based innovations. Sean, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Arthur. That was really a fantastic presentation. So I'm going to introduce our panel, and because we want to get right into all the dialogue we're going to have, then we know that we've made the full bios available, and so I'll give their overall titles, and then we will move into first two moderated questions, so two questions from me for the panel, and then from there we'll have some discussion among the panel, and then we look forward to everyone in the audience sending in again through the Q&A link, sending in your questions. I will then be monitoring those questions and then teeing them up for the panelists. So our first panelist is Professor Artie Rai, who is the Elvin R. Laddie Professor of Law and co-director of the Duke Law Center for Innovation Policy, and that's at Duke Law School. And she also now just recently has taken on a position in the Biden administration, a part-time position as senior advisor in the Office of the General Counsel in the Department of Commerce. We also then have Dan Laster, who is the director of the Washington State COVID-19 Vaccine Action Command and Coordination System, the VAX Center in Washington State. And he had formerly been at PATH, which is an organization, a nonprofit that really helps to get many life sciences products out into developing countries, and in particular was doing a lot with their vaccines program. So he was a perfect match to move over to this state center. And then last but not least, we have Eric Aronson, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Counsel of Intellectual Property at Pfizer. So I think you'll see that we have a great mix of people coming from a spectrum. So from public and the academy and the private sector, in which then we can have this discussion about vaccines, particularly in light of COVID, and then the role of intellectual property in those. So let me now set up and ask the first question, and we'll go through and I'll ask the question, but not repeat it for each panelist. So I'll ask the question and we'll go in the order of Professor Rai, and then Dan Laster, and then Eric Aronson. Okay, so the first question then for our panelists is, are vaccines different from pharmaceuticals from an IP perspective? And so for the participants, to the extent you're not as familiar with it, vaccines are often seen as biologics. They, as Arthur did a great demonstration on, they really come from live cultures, live cells, whereas pharmaceuticals tend to be what we often call small molecules. They're chemical products, primarily more than biologics. So again, the first question is, are vaccines different from pharmaceuticals from an intellectual property perspective? And what role does intellectual property play in making vaccines available for public inoculation? So Professor Rai, we will start with you.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here and I really appreciate the invitation. And those are great questions. I will preface my remarks, as you noted, Professor O'Connor, by noting that I'm speaking entirely in my academic capacity. I am doing this part-time position at the Department of Commerce for a few months, but this is entirely in my academic capacity. So yes, as you've already noted, vaccines are different and biologics generally are different from small molecule drugs. And they are different as well from an IP perspective, more specifically in general. Now, I'm speaking in general terms, but I think it's fair to say that small molecules, the greatest protection they receive from an IP perspective is from the patents and the data exclusivity, if any, that is associated with clinical data for the small molecule. In contrast, for most biologics, the manufacturing process can be quite complicated. They are more complex molecules for the most part, and therefore the manufacturing process can also be the subject of IP, typically trade secrets that's either codified or less codified know-how, which is also a secret, although not necessarily written down anywhere. So that, in the latter case, in the case of the vaccines and biologics more generally, as a consequence, we have both patent protection and trade secrecy / know-how protection providing, playing a role, a very important role in the IP landscape. And typically, the trade secret protection can be just as important as the patent protection. So that's how they're different from an IP perspective. In terms of the role IP plays, well, I think it's really kind of an interesting question for the following reason. As the opening presentation noted, vaccines are perhaps a little bit different from other biologics in that there tends to have been, generally speaking, a fair amount of public funding, whether push, pull, or some combination thereof in the process. And so, although there's also public funding for other types of both small molecule and biologic drugs, in the case of vaccines, the public sector probably has, I think it's fair to say, a heavier footprint. And so then the question becomes, what does that mean for purposes of IP? Well, if you think of IP and public funding as to some extent substitutes for one another in terms of the role, the incentive role they can play, maybe IP is less important in cases of public funding. That said, I should note that particularly with with pull funding, which only comes at the end of the process, that can be a little bit unpredictable, and therefore, maybe IP is useful as another additional bolstering incentive when the money, if there is any, will only come if you produce a product.
Okay. Thanks so much, Professor Rai. Excellent start to our panel. Dan Laster.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but using that as a foundation, I think what is so interesting in the vaccine landscape and the work, for instance, that I did really harkens back to my work at PATH, where we were negotiating for vaccine development. I just want to make a couple of points. One is, as already pointed out, the role of funding in addition to private sector funding in de-risking is just really, really critical. The clinical trials piece is very, very expensive, particularly when you're talking large scale clinical trials, which are typically needed for you're going to get to licensure. And it is very tricky in terms of the balance of the funding and where it's coming from, and then making sure the difference between the development and actual getting to shots in arms at the end of the day. And the timing and the ability to bring partners together. And the one thing I would say about vaccine development also is the multiplicity of parties that typically are needed for success can be very, very high. And so it is valuable having different incentives to bring parties into the equation. But that's where, from an IP perspective, one of the challenges when it's an exclusive that can be withheld, as opposed to having strong IP rights, but there's a need to bring them to the table, really affects the balance. So I did want to flag that piece of the puzzle. The other is, again, just flagging one of the things that Artie said, the issue of trade secret rights and the complexity of know-how and the complexity of effective transfer cannot be overstated. It is just critically difficult. And I've been in many negotiations and discussions where, as a fallback, if the original quote owner or the party with all the rights, they may not have the capacity. And so that's where the capacity piece just becomes so critical. So then the issue is, well, if they don't have the capacity to meet the need, then how do you effectively, in practice, transfer? And that is, I think, one of the things that makes it really, really complex to be successful if you do not have sufficient capacity in both the developed and developing world to actually bring a particular vaccine to market. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, great. It's really helpful. Yeah, I might introduce here to the term show how to emphasize this aspect of know-how. And as Professor Rye was noting, and Mr. Laster, I'll call you Mr. Laster, want to be respectful of everyone here.
Dan.
Yeah, I know. We go way back. But the issue with using the term show how is that it really underscores this emphasis that you need to see someone do it in person, or maybe a video can do it. It's not something, and what I was mentioning back to Artie was, she was saying about codifiable and not so codifiable. And there's just some stuff that we just can't really codify. You just have to watch somebody do it. And that may be one of the biggest issues we have. Okay, so now let's move over to Mr. Aronson and get the industry perspective on all this.
Oh, great. Thank you. And I should repeat as well that I'm speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of the company as well.
I'm sorry, I should have been more clear about that. Sorry.
That's all right. So I'll try to cut through and connect some dots from what, so I don't repeat what some of my fellow panelists said. But the couple of pieces that I would emphasize would be the key difference, and I think this was pointed out, from vaccines to small molecules, is the complexity, right? The complexity, the expense, and something that Dan said, it does take multiple technologies typically to produce current day vaccines. And multiple technologies also often means multiple IP owners, right? So the day of a single owner that owns the process from beginning all the way to the end and every step in between might be a little bit more far and few these days than they were in the earlier days. And so if the goal of patents and IP law and trade secret law is to incentivize and to promote research, right, by this exchange of a period of exclusivity for the eventual release of that product to the public, that incentive system is what led, I would argue, to our situation with COVID and the vaccine that we have now. A key piece of that, and key piece of this incentive system and a robust IP platform, is the ability to transfer knowledge safely and securely, right? With a reduced concern that the transfer of that information would lead to its use in a significant number of other uses beyond its intended purpose. And so when you combine all of that, the ability to bring together the unprecedented number of collaborations between biopharmaceutical industry and governments, universities, and others, all of which you now need to produce a vaccine in the modern day relies on, and in some ways is the foundation that is supported by a strong IP process that secures these rights and puts the incentives in place. I would say with respect to the Pfizer Biontech vaccine, it was the bringing together of the expertise of Biontech and Pfizer to produce the vaccine in the record time that we were able to do it. It's currently right now supplied in 116 countries, potentially more. We've made public commitments to supply 2.5 billion doses by the end of this year, hoping to get to 3 billion, but committed to 2.5. And very timely, this panel, we announced this morning, you might have seen a commitment. In fact, as we speak, I believe there's a press conference going on with President Biden and the CEO of Pfizer, that the U.S. government will purchase 500 million doses of the vaccine for supply in low and lower middle income countries over the next 18 months. So I guess if I was to sum up this first question, it's certainly my belief that in order to do the discovery, the development, the manufacturing, and the access component of the COVID vaccine would not have been possible without an IP system that provided the incentives, that enabled the investment, and then importantly, that sharing of technology amongst a large host of players that were all necessary to go from concept to execution.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, so I think we've set up the basic parameters here now of how we're thinking about vaccines, how they're different from pharmaceuticals, and then the basic role that IP plays. And we've noted that it's not just patents in play, but also trade secrets, and indeed also data exclusivity, which is kind of a third category because it really is something that happens under FDA law and is not directly part of patents or trade secret. So we've got at least three things in play from the IP side. Now, for the second question, again, the second moderated question, well, we don't know what final form, if any, the proposed TRIPS COVID IP waiver will take. Do you see an IP waiver as playing a necessary role in actually increasing vaccine supply and access around the world in the coming year or two? And the second part of the question is, are there potential downsides to an IP waiver that should be taken into account? So again, looking at what role can this IP waiver play, and not knowing what its form is going to take. But then second, are there potential downsides as well? Professor Rai, we'll start with you again.
Sure, yeah, so I don't know that it's necessary. I don't know if I would say that, but I would say that, symbolically on the part of high-income countries, the commitment of some of those high-income countries to at least think about negotiations does suggest an interest in kind of leaning into the problem, the global health problem. Now, whether it will actually assist in any non-symbolic way, I don't know. I mean, that's a much more difficult question because I think that, as we've now all discussed, the know-how, the show-how, the manufacturing capacity, the raw materials, even things like regulatory approvals and export controls and all of that probably are going to be a lot more important. And so then the question becomes, is it going to be as bad as some opponents fear it might be? And there, I also don't know. I mean, I just don't know that it's going to, particularly if it's extremely time limited, have a sort of this cast a giant pall over all incentives for biopharmaceuticals or even vaccines, going forward. And so I think it's a little bit of a sideshow. It's neither as bad as opponents fear nor as good as proponents hope.
Okay, so it's kind of a mixed bag. And again, I know it's a tough question in a way because we don't know what the waiver is going to be. And just so the participants understand what we mean by that, if you haven't been following it closely, it's a proposal that there be a waiver on, and we don't even know which IP yet. Patents obviously should be one thing, perhaps trade secrets, perhaps even copyright in the mix for printed scientific matter. The show how part is a little confusing as to how that would work. So we don't know what kinds of IP, and then perhaps that data exclusivity as well. And then we don't know what exactly the waiver would say. So right now it has to then, if it's going to move forward, it's going to have to be negotiated into a final text. So I just want to make that clear to everyone, because that sort of hamstrings our panelists, and they have nothing concrete to be commenting on at the moment. But still, we need to look at this carefully. Dan Laster, tell us your perspective.
Yeah, and really the primary perspective comes from the 10 years negotiating vaccine development and distribution, global access commitments at PATH. And we've now recognized how important trade secrets and the complexity of the partnerships, and there are so many pieces to the puzzle. Putting aside, and I'll come back to just the classic issue of not having IP. Where trade secrets and know-how and processes and good manufacturing practices is so critical to effectively manufacturing a vaccine, encouraging cooperation rather than just waiving the rights, which, if that were to just happen, wouldn't really necessarily lead to cooperation. So to me, just in principle, given what's at issue and what's needed for success, I'm not sure it aligns well. So that's the first part. And then I do think that we need to take more than a static view. It's very easy that the static view is you've got the vaccine that's already been developed. And so therefore to waive is not as critical, but you know, this isn't a static field. And there is something to ensuring that we're continuing to have sufficient incentives for de-risking and investment. I do think the other piece of the puzzle is to look at the sources of funding. And just to use as an example, say the Gates Foundation, where if they are the funder, they've got global access commitments. So strings do attach. And so I think the more effective way is that when you look to the sources of funding, and in many instances, there is going to be a multiplicity, that is the effective way. I do also think, I mean, this may seem like a contradiction, but the risk, just like the risk of a compulsory license, the risk of a waiver affects the approach that the party with the vaccine will take and may bring them to the table. So it's not the actual imposition of the waiver, but the risk of a waiver. And I think even after this discussion started to arise, I think it may have affected behaviors to voluntarily adjust approaches, adjust pricing, and adjust strategies. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really helpful. And that's sometimes some of you follow margin discussion, margin rights under Bayh-Dole. That's often a mention that they're more in terrorem. You know, they're sort of meant to scare people that it could be exercised, and then hopefully there'll be voluntary discussions. As a transactional lawyer, I'm always a big fan of that. Let's make a deal. Let's make it happen. So, Eric, moving over to you.
So I think I'll focus a little bit more on the practical versus the theoretical, perhaps. And I say that because we're talking, and the conversation is going as if there's a single vaccine. There's actually a few different vaccines that are out there and that are approved, and they're based on different technologies. I don't know if it's Pfizer's presence on this panel or not, but the mRNA vaccine is very different than the J&J vaccine from a technology standpoint, right? The Pfizer Biontech vaccine, more akin to the Moderna vaccine, is based on mRNA technology. Not only is it the first mRNA vaccine, it is the first mRNA drug of any type that's ever been approved. And so when you talk about the incentives and what an IP system would do, it perhaps different depending on what technology you're disclosing. The technology associated with a J&J drug might be very different, and it is, from a new potentially platform technology that might be used in other vaccines, in other medicines, in other cures. And so the risk or the threat of waiving IP with respect to mRNA and thinking that that would stay within just the COVID vaccine and not impact the value of that platform technology might be wrong, right? And so when we're looking at this situation and what, to the question that was originally asked, what would be the impact or the long-term impact of a waiver, it might be different to a new technology and the investment that went into that new technology if the risk of waiving it not only to address the immediate pandemic, but in essence, giving that knowledge, know-how, show-how to the world to use in anything they wanted after the effect, would have a different incentive impact, I think, than in a different scenario. The other practical piece I would point out, and I think Dr. Rai, Professor Rai hinted at as well, is the ability of other manufacturers to, in the near term, produce an mRNA vaccine, all right? And the waiver of IP doesn't create a complex manufacturing entity, right? And so when we're talking about what is a brand new technology that is reliant on certain initial supplies, and then increasing the number of people scrambling to acquire those supplies, and the potential of having part of those people scramble never actually get to end product. Again, looking at this very scenario that we're dealing with now, will a waiver result in an increase, a net increase in doses? I think that's incredibly unclear, particularly when between Moderna and Pfizer, we're already producing billions of doses, and any hiccup into our supply chains by introducing new entrants could result in an impact, a negative impact on our ability to produce. So I say that it's a very practical answer to the question. The theoretical answer, I think, of the long-term impact, I think, is slightly more interesting. But whether or not companies would change their investment thesis or maybe seek more public funding if the risk of IP waiver was there, is a very open question. I'll tell you again, from the Pfizer perspective, Pfizer took no federal funding, no public funding. We invested over $2 billion at risk. The agreements we had with governments are supply arrangements, in essence. If our product was not approved, we weren't paid, right? We weren't paid on effort. We weren't paid on development. We were paid for the delivery of an approved vaccine. And so that type of investment and that the speed at which those decisions were made, that might be impacted in the future if this risk of, well, you can have that investment and yet there might be a waiver down the road, would very well could have impacted. Maybe we don't go with mRNA, right? Maybe we go with a more traditional vaccine. Those types of questions we didn't have to answer in this scenario, but certainly in a post-TRIPS waiver world, those would be very legitimate questions that we would have to face.
Great, thanks, Eric. Yeah, this is great to cover the full range from the policy and then down to the nitty-gritty of practical, how this actually happens. So let me sum up a little bit for the participants, and then we'll move into the discussion, some open discussion, and I will be then moderating the questions. But just for the participants, I think it's useful to see this as two dimensions, at least, two dimensions to a matrix. The first is the kinds of intellectual property and other legal rights at play. So in bucket one, you have, again, patents, trade secrets, and the trade secrets largely covers the know-how and show-how, although it's not clear that it completely encompasses know-how and show-how. So some of it may just sit in its own kind of category. But patents, trade secrets, copyright again for printed journal matter, scientific journals, books, things like that, and then data exclusivity or any other exclusivities that a regulatory agency can put in place. So that's the legal dimension. But then looking at what might be covered, the kind of targets of those kinds of exclusive rights, you have at least three other things that you've heard the panelists talk about. First are the vaccines themselves. And going back to Arthur's presentation at the very beginning, if the vaccine material, this is not the case with modern vaccines, to the best of my understanding, but in going back to the kind of Salk and Sabine vaccine, if you really are just using a inert or killed off version of a naturally occurring vaccine, then no one's getting a patent on that product because it's what we call a product of nature in patent law. So no one gets the patent on that. It's only that it has to have been taken out of the state of nature in some way, isolated, changed, genetically engineered somehow, so that then you have something that's not its natural state. That being said, if it's not in its natural state, then the vaccine itself can be the subject of patents. But then equally important, as we've been hearing, the production methods, how you actually then get this produced, right? And that again can be the subject of patents, can be trade secrets, okay? And then the third category of the objects of the exclusive rights are the research tools. And that's something I think that the panelists were getting at. I think it is one of the biggest areas that folks are worrying about a bit. So it's the tools that can be both methods, but also can involve instrumentation, devices, and all the things that researchers at industry like Pfizer and in the government and in the academy use to do research and development to move towards finding a new vaccine. And that then I think is something that people are quite interested in, whether the IP waiver would cover that or not. Okay, so lots of implications, but I just want to kind of, for everyone, separate out these two dimensions. Okay, now I'd like to open up to the panelists for a moment. If you would like to have any discussion with each other, do you have questions you want to ask? Before I turn it and go through some of the audience questions.
Yeah, this is Dan.
Go ahead.
I do have a question, and it stems from the question of kind of platform innovation. And I do think there's a very different, potentially, but I'd love to hear the other panelists' views on the difference between platform technology, which is what we have for them, MRI. So I don't know if you want to start, Marty or Eric, but I'd love to hear people's views on that.
So yeah, I mean, I had a related question, and so I may as well make that into my answer to your question.
Great.
So the mRNA platform, which is both the mRNA plus the delivery mechanism, you know, everyone talks about it as a platform, and I suppose, and even Pfizer has said, or at least Moderna maybe has said, that the mRNA is like the software, and so it can be switched in and out. And so maybe in part, that's the reason why, if there were even a temporary waiver of IP rights, that could impact all sorts of different markets, like not just infectious disease, but cancer and all sorts of other stuff as well. And so I think that's really interesting, and maybe as a consequence, certainly differentiates it from the situation with inactivated virus, which might or might not be even patent eligible. One of the questions that I had was, does it differentiate it as much from, let's say, an adenoviral vector, which is sort of a platform too, in the sense that you're using it to deliver material? And that's a question actually that is more of a rhetorical question, because I'm not, well, it's less of a rhetorical question, I should say. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but it does strike me that mRNA in particular is, or the technology platform is particularly versatile.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. I think the analogy is apt. we're in a little bit of an interesting state, given that the speed at which we've gone from beginning this research until where we are now. A lot of the IP world hasn't yet settled out with respect to the COVID vaccines. And so I'm reluctant a little bit to answer your question straight on, because these are decisions that are sort of pending before various patent offices around the world about how they will treat all of these things. But I think conceptually there are these two concepts of a carrier and then the software. I think that's right. And I would say, certainly Biontech at least was looking at mRNA in oncology well before COVID started, right? And so what that in and of itself is going to give you an indication of the flexibility that the platform may have to treating different disease states.
Any follow-up back from you, Dan? Or okay. And if not, then Artie, were you able to fold in your question, or would you like to ask another one that you had?
I was able to mostly fold it in, but I suppose that one question I had as a little bit of a follow-up is, in some sense, and maybe this is where I would answer my own question to say that mRNA is more like software than perhaps, the other technologies that could be considered platforms. And as a consequence, to what extent is there a concern, and I assume that it's significant, that it's actually not going to be that complex to manufacture at the end of the day, down the road. I mean, it's a new technology, so it was really hard to manufacture initially, but it may be easier down the road to manufacture than, let's say, an adenoviral vector vaccine or adenoviral vector therapy of some sort. So that's, I suppose, a question for both Eric and Dan.
Eric, you want to start?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if I can opine on that in a way with any clarity. I mean, it's possible. I mean, as is the case even in with the rare disease platforms, that one of the significant obstacles to those gene therapy drugs is the amount of gene therapy that needs to be produced for each dose. And you would suspect over time that the manufacturing processes would continue to evolve to reduce that as an obstacle. And you could presume something might happen similarly in the mRNA space. But from my position, it's too early to say with any definitive.
Yeah, I'm glad that Eric went first, because his initial response was what mine was. I don't have a strong view on this one, so I think it remains to be seen.
Well, so Artie,
Right.
I think sorry, go on, Eric.
Well, the only thing I would add, I guess, is in order for that to happen, there's going to need to be significant investment, right? It just doesn't happen on its own, but there will be significant investment in trial and error, and eventually, the process would change. And in many ways, just to go back to where we started this conversation, that's the very nature of what an IP system is intended to do, right? If we can, develop new processes that allow for the development of the mRNA technology in a cheaper, higher throughput manner, well, the incentive system is designed to do exactly that, right? To encourage that investment for an eventual return in the following years.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is, if there's innovation there, I think, especially compared to some other systems, it is a fairly high bar here. So that, and I think that's the other piece of the puzzle that's important. As long as that there is a high bar in terms of what would be patented, it enables not small changes, innovations to to allow one party to tie up a field. So I think related is maintaining a high bar for patentability, for protection.
And I might respond, Artie. I'd like to have your response back from this as well. I think in some ways what you're really getting at is once we have the mRNA platforms going, when we do the next vaccine based on mRNA, then is it highly customized? You have to highly customize the platform to do that next vaccine, or is it pretty much the same platform will then produce? So the next vaccine is distinct and perhaps there's a patent on the vaccine itself, but not on the platform because the platform can work equally well for that new vaccine. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I thought that, well, and this is part of the question as well, that to the extent that we're just switching out the software, then the only thing that's new is really the software. And so then that's what is the subject of IP as opposed to anything else. And that's a little bit different in my view of the world than how even vaccine development has worked in the past.
Yeah. Although, again, I keep going back to Arthur's wonderful presentation. He mentions a bit of the story that had been muddled for a number of years with the Salk polio vaccine. That Salk had this famous quote of, "Well, you can't." And I'm saying this for a reason now because there's an audience question that I'm going to get to right after this. He has this famous quote about, you didn't patent it because you can't patent the sun. And so sort of, there's this idea that somehow it's just something that everyone needs to share, and and it just seems unbelievable to patent that thing. But in fact, then some recent historians have showed that no, in fact, the IP groups that are behind him did in fact actively try to patent it. But as Arthur mentioned, then the fact that the process was already known, so that's again this platform idea. There was no new platform to produce it, and then because it was just an inert killed version of the naturally occurring thing, then there was nothing to patent there. So that's, I think, what we really have to get at is this question of tracing what exactly we're looking at for IP protection. Okay. All right. So now and we're actually right on schedule, so that's good. We wanted to start at 2:00 here with doing some audience Q&A. I want to then I'm trying to order these in some ways. A lot of great questions. And so I'm actually in a way going to take a first crack, but then I'm really happy for the panelists to come in on this. But I think a very foundational question is from Eliza Yang. And so what she mentions is she apologizes, didn't know if she missed the discussion earlier, but her question is wondering how it would be ethical to allow vaccinations and life-saving medication to be patented. So it really is that foundational question. Again, we have people from all different levels of knowledge of the intellectual property system. And so I think it is just important to mention to Eliza and others that there is a policy discussion you could have on that. But at the moment, at least in the US and a number of other countries, medicines, life-saving medicines, techniques, devices are in fact patent eligible. So you can patent them. Now, there are some countries at different times in different places that have decided that some things shouldn't be patentable, but overall, we have a system, at least again in the US. So I just want to make sure that all the viewers get that as a baseline, that we do have that protection. And then the question can be going forward, what we do with that. Does anyone want to follow up with that further? It's fine if there's no takers. I just wanted to. Okay.
I mean, I guess I would just say that, again, if you think about patents as part of a broader incentive structure, right? Like we do lots of other things in the world of government policy. Are we putting the incentives in place for someone to get up in the morning, spend the money and do the research, right? Because these vaccines, whether ours or anybody's or any new drug or new medicine in general, you still need someone to do the trial and the error and run the clinical trials and prove its safety and efficacy. And a lot of times that fails and you get nothing at the end, but knowledge. You don't get an actual product. And every once in a while, you get an actual product at the end. And so you need an incentive structure that incentivizes, financially or otherwise, people to get up and do that work. And there are brilliant scientists out there whose job it is to do this, but it is a job, right? And so the patent system is one of many mechanisms that provide an incentive to encourage this type of work, to take these types of risks, to invest this type of money in order to get the vaccine to a place where we are comfortable that it is safe and efficacious to administer into healthy humans.
Great. Thanks, Eric.
Uh,
Oh, go on, Dan. Yes.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, though, it is interesting because this discussion comes up in the context of death trips. And if you go back prior to that, we definitely did have a world in which countries looked at whether they were net importers, exporters of IP and in what fields. And so there was a pick and choose approach, including, as you say, on the issue of life-saving drugs, medicines. So, we wouldn't be in this discussion but for the evolution of the law. And I wasn't familiar with this, but I was on a panel just last week, and an expert from an Indian law perspective talked about how initially did not allowed process, but not allowed the ultimate article to be patented. But the requirement of playing on the world stage of TRIPS required it. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah. Okay, so then moving, and I'm trying to put these in sort of an order that makes some sense. I might fail at this miserably, but I want to move to Aman Sinha's question. And it's given that the production of the vaccines and biologic drugs, there is a need for know-how, tech transfer. Can the corresponding patent applications be said to be complying with the complete disclosure requirements? This is a good question because this, in my own experience now, has come up quite a bit. People flagging the disclosure requirement that you only get a patent if you fully disclose the invention. But then how can it be that we're hearing that developing countries need more information? And who wants to take that? Should I just go through the order here, perhaps Artie first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy also to take it because I've written a fair amount about this with Nicholson Price in particular. So I just want to give a shout out to him as well. So it's a really interesting question because there is there are various disclosure requirements in the patent law, and one of the puzzles that we have. Professor Price and I worked through in a bunch of different articles that we've worked on is, how exactly is it that the patents that are filed don't end up providing all the information? And part of it is that it, as Professor O'Connor pointed out, some of the show how is really hard to write down. I mean, so that there's just that. Although, one of the questions that comes up in the patent system is that, well, then do you need to deposit biological materials if there's some biological material that is very difficult to reproduce without a deposit? Then, so we've talked about that in some of our work. Realistically, it's probably not going to happen, but that's a possibility. Another possibility that explains part of the disconnect is, at least for some of these patents, they're filed fairly early on, and so the final thing that's approved by the regulatory agency doesn't exactly look like the thing that the patent was filed on, and so there's a temporal disconnect as well. But I do think that's part of the reason, at least Professor Price and I got interested in this because, in very conventional patent law, one sometimes thinks of patents and trade secrets as alternatives, and they're really not. I mean, that's not how the system has functioned typically in a lot of areas, including drugs.
Dan, do you want to respond to this one?
Nothing really to add on this one.
Okay, Eric?
I guess the only thing I'll add is that vaccines are very different, as we started with, than small molecules, right? So a small molecule, you'll include in the patent the chemical structure, which in many ways is all anybody needs to make that drug, right? With the vaccine, there's no chemical structure. It's a series of processes. And so if you ask yourself, what is the invention? The invention isn't necessarily a COVID vaccine, right? The invention is a bunch of steps in that process. And so without commenting on particular patent applications, but each patent application standing alone should be sufficient. The question is, when the know-how comes in, is how do you put all those patent applications and effectuate them in a way that creates, at the end of the day, a safe and effective vaccine. So I guess in some ways it depends on what are you defining as the invention?
Yeah, I think that's really an excellent point. And to the participants, again, who are not as familiar with patent law, this actually comes from some of my own research, but in the very, very early stages of patent systems, and I'm talking going back to the 1400s and 1500s, what was really meant to be protected was an art. And that's why we still use the term art in the patent system, state of the art, person having ordinary skill in the art. And the art was an entire way of doing something. But that's when we lived in a simpler time, and what we today would call technologies were more straightforward. So it was like, building some sort of relatively simple device. And so then a patent might cover everything you needed to do to build that device. But the modern patent system is different from that in that it has more narrow technical aspects to it, that you can carve out a particular invention and advance, not just in an art overall, but because most of our technologies are so complex now, you can have an innovation just in doing one particular part of that device. So think about an even easier way to think about that is smartphones, where there's cameras in it, there's the display, all these things. So you can patent advances in those different things. And what we're looking at now, and I think what our panelists have done an excellent job is making the situation more complex in the reality of vaccines, that it's not like the old days of a pharmaceutical drug where it's like, hey, there's the chemical, there's the molecule, and you get a patent on it, and that's all that matters. Now, that was never exactly true either, but now we're seeing there's a lot more of this kind of complexity. So I just want to again flag that for the participants. Now, let's move on to, speaking of incentives, going back to one of the first questions from an anonymous attendee, as noted in the introduction, the number of vaccines currently available is relatively few compared to the number of pathogens we could theoretically protect against. Can you speak to what type of incentives the industry may provide to advance vaccine development at the research stage while also protecting the intellectual property of the scientists? So I think this question is really getting at that. Hooray, we've done a fantastic job on this we're doing a good job, and we need to distribute more, but there's all these other ones that might be out there. How are we then getting the incentives right for those? Eric, do you want to, I'll start with you and we'll work in reverse order.
Well, I'm not sure this is a vaccine question or this is an infectious disease question, because that same question has been asked many times with respect to infectious disease treatments in general, particularly as the cases or the evidence of resistance to antibiotics continues to rise. Is enough focus, attention, and research being put into infectious disease work? And excuse me. And there has been some efforts, at least in the United States in recent years, to increase the amount of incentive that companies have to do research in infectious disease. But I think it's an excellent question it evidences the difficulty and the amount of time and energy to treat these types of infectious diseases and the uniqueness of the infectious disease space. And I say that because, if you invent a new infectious disease drug, putting aside vaccines for a second, you invented a new infectious disease drug, chances are it's going to be used as a drug of last resort, because they want to continue to preserve that drug in case the earlier drugs, the vancomycins of the world that have been out for years, are not effective. And so you want to hold this one back, the new one, to ensure that it remains non-resistant to the pathogens. From a manufacturer standpoint, from an investment standpoint, it's difficult to invest in something that you're going to be used last, only after all the other things go forward. So it's a very unique and difficult space that there's a struggle around it from a policy standpoint, not only within vaccines, but with infectious disease in general.
Dan?
I'll just add a comment from a different lens, which is it depends upon the disease. I mean, and again, harking back to my work with PATH, if the disease is one that affects the developed world, the wealthier countries, then there may be a sufficient market there to create the incentives to have the right investment the area that I was working in was, whether it was neglected or the market was really, the need was great in the developing world, low resource settings, but was there a market that would support just private sector investment? And the answer was typically no. So then the issue, and especially again, there's the early upstream research, but then there's the clinical research. And so you really then needed to alter the incentive structure. And that's where, whether it was public funding or foundation funding. And again, the Gates Foundation really stepped up to help de-risk. And so I think you really need to look at the market and the disease to determine whether in fact there's sufficient investment, because there may be a need, but there may not be the resources to support if we just do it private sector.
Artie.
Yeah, so following up on both of those comments, I mean, a patent is very much a pull incentive that's dependent on the market, whereas other pull incentives, let's say prizes or what have you, don't necessarily depend on a paying market on the demand side. So yeah, I think that's one piece of the puzzle that's really important. And then also going back to Eric's point about wanting to keep your best weapons in reserve, if you will. I do think that there is, perhaps this will be a little bit of a wake-up call for thinking about infectious disease research and the development of therapies and vaccines as a little bit from a defense perspective, a biodefense perspective, because I think historically biodefense has been considered soft in terms of the spectrum of areas defense a defense ministry or department could invest in. But it seems to me that biodefense has, the need for it has shown itself pretty clearly. And so if we can think of it as a public sector investment that we don't use because we don't need to, I think that would be really useful.
Great, thanks. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit. There's an interesting question. There's a couple of them, but and they both sort of relate to liability for the vaccine when it's out there. So the first one from Tanar is in relating to vaccine manufacturing with IP rights. If some side effect was occurred because of the vaccine, who has responsibility for that? The country of the vaccine's inventor or the organization who was allowed to use the intellectual property? Artie, do you want to start with that? We'll go in the regular order again.
Sure, I would say it depends because it depends on what the contractual arrangements were. So I know, for example, right now, and perhaps Eric can speak to this more, one of the reasons that the Pfizer vaccine has not, as I understand it, been introduced in India yet is they're still negotiating waivers of liability protection with the Indian government. And so, to the extent that there's a government that has waived liability or has assumed liability, I guess, that's one thing. But if there's not, then presumably the manufacturer would be responsible.
Dan, perspective?
Yeah, just a brief comment again, going to Artie's point about the contractual terms. I think, of course, what is the governing law in the country? But this is where I know that when supply commitment agreements, those become critical in terms of risk allocation and can very much be some of the showstoppers. And I know my understanding is that has been one of the tricky issues, trying to land that piece, because it can be very large. And so may become as important as pricing.
Eric?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think the risks and the benefits that were just discussed are what we are, in fact, in the middle of engaging on. It's a difficult, thorny issue when you balance speed with liability. And so we have, as a company, have taken the view that we will seek indemnity and liability protections in our agreements, because we think it's the right balance of risk and between us and the countries. It's one thing to do that in the high income countries. It's another thing to do it in the low income and lower income countries. And so the purchase by the US government is one way of helping this very issue, right? Where you have a high income country step in the middle and be the supplier. But these are difficult issues when you're talking about the speed at which we want the vaccine rollout to go against the potential. As lawyers, that's all we think about is, well, what could happen, right? What if? And that what if for a product that could eventually be used by every person in the world is a big what if.
Yeah, and so that was the another question that was about the indemnification request itself. But I think that the original question, and I might be reading this in from some other discussions I've had too, is let's put a point on it for a moment and forget about and it's complicated in some ways, but so for companies that are actually producing and distributing the vaccine, even if they're going through an intermediary like the US government, but what if the IP waiver does go through? And so in fact, you have completely disconnected third parties. They are not procuring the drug from the upstream manufacturer, from Pfizer or others. They're manufacturing completely on their own based on just simply reading the patents and trying to get access somehow to the know-how. Then if something goes wrong with that vaccine, then is there liability? In the US, when we think about tort law, this is the classic, is it a design defect so that there's liability because it's the designer designed it wrong, or is it a manufacturing defect? Do any of you mind kind of chiming in on that? I think that's a little bit of the heart of the question.
Sounds like a law school question.
No, I swear I got it from the Q&A here. All right, well, yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, in the United States, it would be, that's how it would work, I would assume, but I don't know enough about the tort law of other countries to be able to opine.
But it is just a relevant question because of the situation that if the IP waiver goes through and a company like a Pfizer or another Pfizer has absolutely no role in producing the vaccine that gets used, could there be some liability that comes up?
So okay. I can maybe just opine, just not to answer that specifically, but just as a sort of around that. So, first is that the product would still need to get approved by the regulatory agency in that country, right? They still need to conduct the clinical trials, go through the quality approval process. It's not as if they get the recipe and then once they make the product, they can go sell it. They still have to test it and ensure it's safe and reliable. One of the other risks that comes with that is, again, putting our lawyer hats on in the what if world, right? What does that do to vaccine confidence if one of those manufacturers has a vaccine and it's the Pfizer vaccine, even though it's not, or the Pfizer Biontech vaccine, but they did something along the way that changed the process a bit. And now vaccine confidence starts to wane again. And, the internet explodes with Pfizer Biontech vaccine unsafe, right? That's one of the other risks that we need to be concerned about from an IP waiver standpoint.
Yeah, and that's part of what I was driving at with this. Now, Eric, I think you've actually already sort of answered. The answer is, we don't know exactly the status of a lot of the patent applications but that was one of the questions, quite correctly, focusing on that since these are all new, have patents even been granted yet? And I think that, so the end of that particular question from this anonymous person is, how does the status of the patent apps impact discussions already waivers? And I think the idea there is, well, wait a minute, if there's no patent been issued already anyway, then do we need a waiver? Anyone want to respond to that?
Well, I would make one clarifying point to start, which is there have been some patents that have been granted. The mRNA technology has been studied for many years. What hasn't come yet is patent applications about COVID-19 vaccines. specifically, or the application of that mRNA technology to COVID. But you know, on the IP waiver, on the TRIPS waiver piece, we haven't seen the draft yet, but the draft will be very telling whether it's patent waiver or patent and know-how waiver, right? Because yes, if the patent hasn't been granted yet, there's no patent to waive. But does that mean that hypothetically, Pfizer scientists have to sit down with 20 different generic companies and explain to them how to make the Pfizer Biontech vaccine when they could be working on the next variant that might be coming down the pike, right? Again, some of the considerations, because it's not, the point to reiterate, I think, is it's not a small molecule, here's the chemical structure, reverse engineer it, and you're done. It is a significantly different, complex, lengthy process that requires much more time-intensive resources to go from, you know, biological material to vaccines.
Yeah, and just following on to that, this is what I was alluding to much earlier in terms of the work that we did at PATH, the partnerships and the complexity of them and the degree of cooperation that's needed to effectively transfer and share the information is really complex. And so unless somehow the waiver imposes a duty to disclose and cooperate for free, that's a whole different thing than simply effectively waiving your ability to assert an IP right. And why in this space, again, I'm dubious of the efficacy in you still need to cooperate and have that soft know-how, show how, however you want to describe it. There's just tons of give and take, people flying over to see the plant. I mean, there's just so much involved there that I don't see it as effective. And I just can't imagine we're talking about the duty to participate in a developing country or in other countries setup of a manufacturing site, or full details of their supply channel, or a whole number. They're just an array of complexities, at least from my perspective. I don't know if Eric and Artie have a different view on it. So
I don't have a different view, but the only thought that I had was, maybe in some, distant future, if vaccines again are more like software, then knowledge is codified, and so then it kind of changes the IP calculus, because right now patents are one small piece of the puzzle, whereas if knowledge is more codified, like it is with small molecules, for example, then patents become a much bigger piece of the puzzle. Great.
Okay, so going through some of the other questions that we have, a lot of them are kind of getting at some of the similar ideas, and let me try to wrap a few of them together. Basically, a lot of the question comes down to developed countries developing these vaccines, and then is IP kind of, because that's locking it away in some level, although we know the show how is a little different because you'd have to actually convey that. And then the developing countries would like to then have access to that. Then how do we balance this as a matter going forward? Is there a way, I think in some ways to sum up the questions, is there a way to have developing nations participate more somehow, even in the earlier R&D stages, so that they're part of all this, rather than always having to wait for something to happen in the developed world and then maybe or maybe not trickle down to them? So let me just sum it up another way. How do they get in the game? Is there a way to get them in the game so they are participating in the R&D and then can have some claims to sharing in the benefits when things emerge? Artie, do you want to start, and then we'll move through the order?
Yeah, no, I think that's the really hard question, not necessarily for the immediate crisis, but for the future. And how does every country develop at least some manufacturing capacity? Because I don't think it's it's wise for any country to rely only on other countries' donations. I just don't think that's a wise strategy going forward. And so, but how one does that, you know, you need human capital, you need physical capital, a lot of stuff that, you know, the reason that these are low income and lower middle income countries is that they don't have that capital. And that's a much larger international development question that I'm not sure I have the answer to, regrettably.
Dan?
It's funny, but that the work of PATH was doing a lot of that, in that we did not always work with the major multinationals, but we're working with developing country vaccine manufacturers. Obviously now Serum is the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world, but we work with them. I mean, there were just a whole number of them. And so there is some network, but it just needs to be strengthened and expanded. And the question is, how do you effectively do that? You don't do that in an instant. It's that work that requires building so many skill sets, good clinical practices, good manufacturing, you know, learning how to do licensure. So that it's critical work that has to happen. And that is where you need public-private partnerships to make it happen, I think.
Eric?
Yeah, I think those answers are spot on. There's a little bit of circular reasoning or circular logic here. It's, you know, stop being a low income country, right? It's crazy, right? But you need the resources, the infrastructure, everything that already said. But if you had all that, you wouldn't be a low income country, right? And so that's why Dan's comments are so spot on, is because you need these other funding mechanisms, these other partnerships, these other technology transfers to fill that gap, because that's the inherent issue. And not to be a total homer on all this, but part of that infrastructure is the IP system that provides those incentive mechanisms to do those investments and to create that intellectual property, low I, low P, in that country, because you know it would be, that investment will be protected for it. So, I mean, going full circle back to where we started this discussion.
Yeah, I think I'll add too that it's important for the participants to note that in many of the countries, these things are not even necessarily patented at all in that country. Patents are territorial. So in fact, when you have, whether it's university or private industry inventors of these things, they're only seeking patents generally in the large developed nations. So that's kind of the odd paradox, is that in many of the most needy developing countries, there are no IP barriers right now within the country to go ahead and do that. But then the question is, how do you convince, I think that's what Eric and all our panelists are saying, how do you convince people with the knowledge to come in there and then help you then develop that capacity? So we're at time. Yeah, go on.
So I was just real quick, I would say my company, as well as many others, have a stated public policy of non-enforcement of patents in the lower income countries. So we've said we're not going to enforce the patents there because we know what the need is there. That's not necessarily the obstacle. It's all these other things that we've talked about.
Yeah. So since we're at time, I want to give each of the panelists a last if they want to make any final comments, and then we will close out. So starting with Artie, any final comments?
So I do think that regrettably, the public debate on the quote unquote IP waiver has been very simplistic, and I hope that, you know, we've tried to shed some light rather than shouting at one another. And so thank you.
Thank you. And that's exactly the kind of dialogue we wanted to have. Get into the nuances, really, you know, keep our heads about us and try to get through it. And thank you. Dan.
No, I would just echo what Artie said, that it is a complex topic. And I do think, though, it's not about the waiver. I do think there are mechanisms that can help lead more likely to the outcomes we want. that's the only thing I would add to it. I mean, there are issues such as reasonable, RAND terms and other things. There are mechanisms that may lead people to negotiate in a more constructive way. I think issues relating to country liability, these topics, you can set the ecosystem up in a more optimal way so that you get these vaccines in a more equitable way around the world.
Thanks. Eric.
And I guess I would just end with, I think we all have the same goal, to figure out ways to bring medicines and vaccines to patients, no matter where they are in the world. We're fortunate and thrilled that our vaccine has had that potential to change lives. And our goal is to continue to bring that, to ensure access of that vaccine, and ensure that we can bring the next vaccine, the next medicine, the next breakthrough to patients around the world as well. That is our goal at the end of the day, and at the beginning of the day.
Right. All right, let's do a virtual round of applause for all of our panelists. And it was always odd over the internet, but I know that everything was really appreciated. And now I want to close out by thanking Arthur, who's come back on. I see him there. We love this partnership with the Lemelson Center at the Smithsonian. We've been doing it every year for a number of years now as part of our WIPO summer school that we run here at CPIP. And so on behalf of Arthur, the Lemelson Center, and us at CPIP, and to all of our panelists, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks for an excellent discussion. And I hope we will see greater equity in continuing to distribute access for these important vaccines. Thank you all.